Get ready for a ride.
Yeah, we're riding.
All right, so before we start here, I just want to introduce the three beautiful people that have agreed to join us for this panel this morning. To my immediate right here, we have Skye Cleary. She's a philosopher and the author of the book Existentialism and Romantic Love. She also teaches at Columbia City College and Barnard. So please, round of applause for Skye Cleary. In the middle, we have Massimo Pigliucci. He's a professor of philosophy at City College, the author of, I looked it up, like more books and articles than I could count, and I have a PhD in theoretical physics. This is his.
Be able to count.
That's how I should be able to count. Yeah, but I'm not good with integers. This is his third appearance at this year's NECSS, which is just a statement of how valuable he is to everybody here. He also has a recent book, which you should pick up. It's wonderful. It's called How to Be a Stoic. So please, a round of applause for Massimo Pigliucci. And finally, all the way from Australia, although Skye, that's true for you as well in some sense, we have Richard Saunders. Richard is the former two-time president of the Australian Skeptics. He's the host of the Skeptics Zone podcast. He's on TV and various other media outlets frequently. He's a fellow of PsyCop, and he's also a committee member on the James Randi Educational Foundation $1 Million Challenge. So please, a round of applause, Richard Saunders. So thank you all for joining us here today. Here's what we're going to do, because I realize not everybody might be familiar with what the conceptual penis hoax is. We're going to try to say the word penis, by the way, as much as possible today on this panel.
Penis.
Yes, thank you, Massimo. No, that's great. Keep that up while I do this. So let me just lay out the facts of the case without any editorializing, and then we can all get into some deep dive editorializing afterwards. All right, so here it is. And I encourage you panelists, please, if I say anything incorrect, jump in and correct me. All right, so earlier this year, two guys wrote an article entitled The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. These two guys are...
social construct.
Social construct, yes. These guys used thinly veiled pseudonyms to publish the article, but their real names, and I'm not telling tales out of school here, they came clean with this shortly after. Peter Boghossian, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Portland State University in Oregon, and James Lindsay, who is the author of a number of books and is a math PhD with a physics background as well. I do want to add right here that we invited these gentlemen to be on the panel today, and they wanted to be here, but unfortunately couldn't. Holiday weekend and all that stuff, but we are not going to speak ill of the dead, so to speak. They were invited to be here, and hopefully we'll hear some commentary. Yeah. Well, without asking the dead to be alive first, maybe is the better way of saying it. Anyway, they were invited to be here, and I'm curious if they see this, what their reaction will be to this discussion, because of course we'd love to hear it. So here's what the article says, and it's a little hard to determine what the article says because by the author's own admission, it is a lot of kind of gobbledygook words, but I'm just going to quote some stuff from it here. Quote, "Penises are not best understood as the male sexual organ or as a male reproductive organ, but instead as an enacted social construct that is both damaging and problematic for society and future generations." All right, another quote, and this is one that you've seen a lot in discussions of this, is the conceptual penis is, and then I'll elide some stuff here, the conceptual driver of climate change. And some of the words that I emitted there are something about, the rapaciousness of modern industrialism and blah, blah, blah. That's kind of the point they're trying to get across there. By their own admission, the article used nonsense quotes from fake papers that don't exist. These quotes were kind of auto-generated, and the authors repeatedly claim that they're just kind of saying nonsense and putting words that sound good together. So they wrote this article, they submitted it to a journal called Norma, N-O-R-M-A, the International Journal for Masculinity Studies, which was rejected, and in their rejection letter it was suggested that they submit to another journal called Cogent Social Sciences, and after a few minor revisions it was accepted there in May of this year, May 2017. So very shortly after this, the authors then wrote an article for Skeptic magazine, which most of you know, coming clean that this was in their words, a Alan Sokal-style hoax. And we'll talk about the Sokal thing, I'm sure, in a little bit. Immediately after this coming clean, there were a lot of accolades from various prominent voices in the skeptical community. So I'll just quote some of them here. Sam Harris said, quote, "This is glorious." Michael Shermer, in a little paragraph forward to the article, said that Skeptic magazine was proud to publish this expose. And Richard Dawkins said that this was a Sokol-style satire on pretentious, quote-unquote, gender studies. So in the article, when you might ask what the point of this whole thing was, they claim that this hoax is basically a condemnation for two things. One is the field of gender studies, and also, in general, pay-to-publish journals, which Cogent Social Sciences is one example of, although I guess we can discuss that as well. So again, to quote stuff from their Skeptic article, they said, quote, "We assumed we could publish it outright, we assumed we could publish outright nonsense, provided it looked the part. That is to say, provided it looked like something that might appear in what they think of as a typical gender studies journal." Here's another quote. Quote, "Part of the fault may fall on the open access pay-to-publish model, but the rest falls on the entire academic enterprise collectively referred to as, quote-unquote, gender studies. And as we see it, gender studies in its current form needs to do some serious housekeeping." And then they then spin this into some final thoughts on the article, which were basically they say one of the questions is here, how can we restore the reliability of the peer review process? So, and I'm almost done with this, and then we can get to the discussion. Immediately following this and some positive reactions, there were a number of negative reactions as well. So just to quote a few of them here, James Taylor, who's a philosophy prof at the College of New Jersey, said, quote, "It turns out that the joke's on the hoaxers themselves, both for failing to spot some very obvious red flags about this journal and for their rather bizarre leaps of logic." He goes on to say that this tells us very little about gender studies, but an awful lot about the perpetrators of this hoax. And then finally, one more voice out there, this guy, Ketan Joshi, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's a blogger and a scientist, said, quote, "A single instance isn't sufficient evidence to conclude that an entire field of research is crippled by religious man-hating fervor." So, those are the facts of the case, as it were. Of course, there's been a number of articles and think pieces, et cetera, written about this since all these things have been going back and forth. Some people are strongly in favor, some people are strongly not in favor. Some people are strongly not in favor. And so really what we want to do today is just talk about this, get reactions from the panel, and try to see not just this hoax in particular, but also hoaxes in general, something about, whether they are a good thing, whether they are helpful or not. So let me just open it up to the panel by asking, were these guys successful? Does this hoax do what they claim to do? Is it both in terms of being a condemnation of a field of study and making pay-to-publish journals look bad?
Okay. No, I think this was a major embarrassment for the skeptic community, and I told that directly to Peter Boghossian, one of the two co-authors of the hoax, for a number of reasons. I mean, some people hopefully were here yesterday during my talk about virtue epistemology. Well, they failed almost every bullet point on that table that I showed you, that what you should do when you try to be a virtuous skeptic. For one thing, as you just mentioned, in terms of logic, that doesn't stand up. This is n equal 1, a sample size of 1. Right. It shows precisely nothing other than the editor and or a couple of reviewers of a particular journal didn't do their due diligence. That's what it shows. And Peter should know that because he teaches critical thinking. So that's one thing.
Do you know Peter or James well?
Yeah, I know both of them. Okay. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, they actually their paper their so-called experiment failed because the paper was in fact rejected by an unranked journal. The first journal you mentioned, it's unranked. That means that it's pretty low on the academic pecking order, and even they rejected it. So they went to a journal that is even lower than that. So all they showed is that a really, really awful journal accepts bullshit papers. Oh gee, that's a surprise. That happens in the sciences as well, right? I mean, yes. We have lots of examples of fraudulent papers that have been accepted by science journals, often higher science journals than the ones that Peter and Lindsay have targeted. Also, The thing to keep in mind here is that what they also explicitly say in the article in the Skeptic magazine that they did not bother to look at the gender studies literature. So they are criticizing something of which they avowedly, and in fact proudly, know nothing about. It's a massive failure. And let me just one more comment, because I'm really curious about what my colleagues here think about this thing. But you mentioned some of the immediate response that sort of major people in the skeptic community had. To me, that is the major failing. It's not just that somebody did the hoax and misguided way, but it's the fact that immediately, you mentioned, let's see, Schirmer, Harris, and Dawkins, right?
Yes.
And then there was also Pinker, new academic hoax, a bogus paper on the conceptual penis gets published in a high-quality peer-reviewed journal. Not a high-quality peer-reviewed journal. Jerry Coyne, cultural studies, including women's studies, are particularly prone to the toxic combination of jargon and ideology that makes for such horrible scholarship. Jerry Coyne probably, I'm pretty sure 95% has never actually read anything in either women's studies or gender studies, and yet he has this ideological bent of his own. So it was really a disaster. And finally, the thing that really shows that it was a disaster is Sokal himself. So Sokal was invited to publish a commentary on this.
Can we just very quickly, for those who don't know, say who Sokal is?
Sure. Sorry, Alan Sokal is a physicist at NYU. He's not here today only because he's in London, because we invited him as well, and he would have loved to come. He was invited to write a commentary in Skeptic magazine. You're welcome to read it. It's available online. And the commentary was, shall we say, cautious at least about the impact of this new hoax. But I'm going to read what Sokal wrote about his own hoax. So back in the 90s, there were these science wars going on between some misguided postmodernist, extreme postmodernist philosophers on one hand, who were saying that science is just a social construction. Science is a social construction, by the way. Everything we do is a social construction by definition, because it's a social enterprise. But if you say it's just or mostly a social construction, that's where you get into trouble. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had a bunch of scientists and philosophers of science who were saying, no, wait a minute, it's not quite that simple. You can't dismiss science just on that basis. So Sokal did a similar kind of hoax, but he targeted actually a fairly high-level journal, Social Text, although it was a non-peer-reviewed journal, interestingly. And he did get a fake paper on the hermeneutics of quantum mechanics published.
Quantum gravity, I believe, right?
I think it was
quantum gravity.
Well, quantum gravity. Yes, that's right. That's right. And then he wrote this expose. But here's what he said about the significance of his own hoax. From the mere fact of publication of my parody, I think that not much can be deduced. It doesn't prove that the whole field of cultural studies or cultural studies of science, much less sociology of science, is nonsense. Nor does it prove that the intellectual standards in these fields are generally lax. This might be the case, but it would have to be established on other grounds. It proves only that the editors of one rather marginal journal were derelict in their intellectual duty. That's it. Okay? And so why did he do it? Because he used that as a rhetorical move to sort of spotlight a certain area that he saw problematic. But that's Sokal's own understanding of what he did. So I have no idea where Peter and James came up with this thing.
All right, so Skye.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. So I want to give them a little bit of credit.
Is her mic on?
Oh, it's not on. Hello?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. So I think they do a really good job of criticizing pay-to-play journals. However, it's a really easy target, as Massimo said. It's a low-hanging fruit. It was rejected by not a very good journal, and Taylor and Francis, it looks like, channeled their email into a very low-quality journal. I mean, they say on their website we're a high-quality journal, but I think, as you pointed out in your critique, they also say, oh, we're very friendly towards authors, and we're not necessarily going to reject an article just because we don't think it has any impact. And they'll gladly take $1,350 of your money to publish it, which is, it sounds like they're pretty flexible on that. But I think this is a problem with academic publishing in general that is targeting authors who are keen to publish and who need to publish for the to be in academia. It's part of the academic process. And so something that Boghossian and Lindsay said was that profit trumps academic quality, and I think it does in this case, and I think they showed that pretty well. However, I agree with Massimo that gender studies, they didn't discredit that as a whole field of study. I mean, Aristotle said one swallow doesn't make a summer, and I think one bad penis article doesn't discredit a whole industry. However, I probably shouldn't use the analogy of swallows in talking about penises, but yeah, I mean, it's so cool.
Joke number one, folks. We're going to keep it count.
I mean, Sokol knew, as Massimo said, that his paper didn't discredit the whole field of cultural studies. So, yeah, I'll hand over to you.
All right, Richard.
Radio. Am I on? Hello? 1, 2.
Ooh, now you're on.
That was my fault. I did the old Muppet thing, you know. Okay. What a seductive idea. We're talking about penises, and I use the word seductive. Okay, that's.
I know, right? That was easy.
Oh, that was. What a seductive idea it is, and this is in the history of skepticism, which I might get to a little bit later on, where I'll be covering some other hoaxes to put them in context. What a seductive idea it is to think that we can get leverage from our point of view by pulling the wool over our enemy's eyes, or to make people look silly, to say, see, look at that, we did this, therefore we're better. I'm in broad agreement with my colleagues here on the stage. It appears to me that this, oh no, it's 3, fell flat. Anyway.
3.
It's not going to stop, I'm sorry. But maybe we can say, well, yeah, it did, I think, fail, but every cloud has a silver lining. One of the silver linings to this cloud is we're here talking about it and progressing the commentary on hoaxes in general. As I say, it's a seductive idea, and especially in the early days of, say, the Australian Skeptics, which I'll get to a bit later on. One of the philosophies at the time was, well, how can we get publicity? What can we do? Now, there's a very famous man in Australia by the name of Dick Smith, and I'm sure that name is familiar to many people here in the audience. He got his millions from the electronic business, but he has used it very wisely. He's given masses of his wealth to charities and good causes, and he's a very patriotic Australian. But he knew earlier on to get publicity for his various causes was to have hoaxes, stunts, publicity stunts, but they were all very good-natured. He was going to build a fake iceberg and tow it into Sydney Harbour. Say, look, I'm bringing fresh water from the South Pole to Sydney Harbour. And half the media were already there waiting for this iceberg to appear, but of course it was a big publicity stunt. So from that point of view, hoaxes can be funny and good and everyone gets a laugh and it doesn't harm anybody. But then the danger is the next step, which leads to something like this, which is problematic, which is to say, for example, when it comes to the psychic industry in Australia or whatever it is, let's have a fake psychic, let's do this and pull the wool over the media's eyes or the believer's eyes. That will get us far, that will really prove our point. Very problematic. And a bit later on I'll be discussing some of these famous hoaxes in Australia. But we must look again at the aims. What was the idea behind all these hoaxes? What did people hope to accomplish? And in this situation, I think, broadly speaking, we can agree that the original aims of the hoaxes haven't really been met, I don't think.
Yeah, so it sounds like, Richard, part of what you're saying is that there are two parts of a hoax, right? There's the perpetration and then there's the interpretation, right?
Yes.
So
yeah.
one thing I'm curious to get your guys' reaction on is there any problem with if they just put this article out and then basically not even interpreted it, just said, hey, look, we got this crazy article published, interpret as you will. Is that in and of itself problematic?
Yeah, I think it's still a hoax. Yeah, I think so. But one of the things, if you're perpetrating a hoax, I guess you're so emotionally invested in it, you want to get everything out of it you can, including a feeling of superiority.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of people reacted to. So it felt like, I forget, there are many, many voices who said this, is it felt very self-congratulatory and like, not to put too fine a point on it, a bunch of white guys patting themselves on the back for punching down at, at a kind of very female-driven field.
That's why, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I think it would have been much worse if they hadn't have published that article alongside it in Skeptic magazine.
You think it would have been worse had they not published the Skeptic article?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I think that was important to have that and to come clean and say, look, this was a hoax, because there are many other hoax articles which have done a huge amount of damage. I mean, for example, the one about the autism linked to vaccines. I mean, that's caused a huge amount of issues and took 12 years to be retracted and caused deaths. And so that's much more dangerous. So I give them credit for actually coming out and saying it. I mean, it was like in a very self-advertising kind of way, though.
I wanted to point out that I think I'm going to somewhat disagree with Skye giving too much credit, really, to Peter and James. Because yes, it's true that part of what they write in the Skeptic magazine sort of accompanying expose article, etc., is that, oh, but one of our targets was also the paper to publish literature, and the fact, exposed the fact that the standards of peer review are low. I just don't believe that. I think that was an after the fact. When they got rejected from the first journal was not a paper published, number one. Mm-hmm. So that was not the original target. Right? They had to go to a pay-to-publish journal in order to get the Hoax through, and then once that they got it out, said, well, now we got this thing, now we have to somehow explain why we went that way, and they wrote part of the expose about, as if the thing was about the that aspect of the industry. But that would have been much more convincing had they actually targeted a journal that they knew something, in a field that they knew something about. Right? So either a philosophy journal, in the case of Peter, or a science journal. That would have been much more, and by the way, it would have succeeded, because there's plenty of other journals that would have probably done and published something like that. The pay-to-publish sort of culture is problematic. It is the result of years and years of bizarre evolution of the peer review system, and the fact that high-level journals, academic journals, are insanely expensive. I mean, subscriptions, library subscriptions to a lot of these journals, not these journals, but the top-level, middle-level journals even, runs into the thousands of dollars, right? Yeah. So this is just insane. The whole academic publishing industry is bizarre. Just to give you an idea, so here's how publishers make money, a lot of money out of academic publishing. So the research is usually paid for by a federal agency or some other kind of granting agency. So the editor, the journal doesn't pay for it. The salary of the authors is paid by a university or similar organization, so the journal doesn't pay for it. The journal then sends out the paper for review to somebody in academia who is also now paid for doing that job by the journal. And then they publish it and sell it, and also own the copyright. I cannot post my own papers on my own website because they have the copyright of these things. So it's a really bizarre scheme that really ought to be opposed, and it has been opposed in the last several years with open access journals and things like that. But one of the spin-offs of that approach has been this pay to publish, because these things do cost. So somebody's got to pay for it.
Well, one thing I think is interesting to point out, I don't know how many people in this room are in academia, but at least if you're in a field, in a very specific subfield, you know what the good journals are and you know what the bad journals are. But you move one tiny degree of separation away. So for me, as a theoretical high-energy physicist, I knew where the good, particle physics and string theory journals were. But if you asked me what a good condensed matter journal was, I could give you one prime example, but maybe the second-tier things, I don't know. And it's very, very hard when you're not in your precise subfield of academia to say what is a generally good or bad journal. And you can do some research and you can try to figure it out, but it's not always obvious from just doing things. So there was a bit of debate on is Norma, the first journal they tried, is that a decent thing? The consensus seems to be no, it's not really, it's not good, but it's not obvious to me, No.
Well, you would have to ask somebody in gender studies.
Right, exactly.
Which I did, by the way. I have colleagues in gender studies, and they said, no, that's an unranked journal. Nobody publishes there.
Yeah.
And Cogent isn't even a gender studies journal. It's an interdisciplinary one.
Yeah. And that in and of itself is an important fact, right? Yeah.
Let's, if I may digress a little bit back in time. First of all, folks backstage, I'm getting a little radio chatter behind me. It's a little bit concerning. It's security, or I don't know what's going on.
I asked her to turn it down.
Thank you.
Thank you, way ahead of me. A quick point, something Skye briefly mentioned. Were you referring to Andy Wakefield, the autism? I think it's probably worth looking at that briefly when we're talking about hoaxes or frauds.
Yeah.
Now, one clap. Two. Now, I don't think he set out to, I'm going to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. This is a great hoax and I'll get a big... I think he was shown to be fraudulent. I think there's sometimes a fine line. Maybe if you tried to defraud someone later on, you can try to get out. So you'll get out of jail. Oh, it's just a hoax. Ha, ha, ha. Oh, I'm so clever. But, yeah, I think there's a little difference there. But let's look at getting back to the aims of hoaxes. If it's to win hearts and minds, I don't think hoaxes are a particularly good way to go about it. They can get you a lot of publicity, a lot of media, a lot of interest, but I don't think they're the way to win the hearts and minds of people you're trying to reach. Now, two cases I'll briefly mention that happened in Australia, both involving the American skeptical movement. The first case was in 1984. And we're talking about a very different time. Bear this in mind. I'm going to discuss two cases of famous hoaxes. Today, if we want to find out about somebody, it doesn't take us very long. We can reach for our phones, we can Google, we can Facebook, we can get lots of information. Way back in the 80s, that simply wasn't the case, and especially for people in Australia. So we had the situation where some Australian skeptics thought it would be a good hoax, a good idea, to see if they could fool the Australian public, but specifically believers in the paranormal. So the aim of this hoax was to show how believers could be hooked or hoodwinked by somebody posing as a psychic, and you think that's a pretty easy thing to do, really. So there was a wonderful man by the name of Bob Steiner, who was in the Bay Area Skeptics, and I met Bob. He was a charming fellow, he was a magician, but he would do a psychic act, and at the end of his psychic act, a stage reading, mentalism, he would say, I'm a mentalist, it's all just an act. So it was thought it would be a good idea to bring him to Australia as a psychic, give him lots of media, and see if the skeptics at the time could fool believers in Australia to thinking this man was a real psychic. That's exactly what they did. They flew him to Australia, they arranged media appearances for him, radio, newspaper, television, 1984 in Australia, somebody coming from America, they lapped it up. They really did. So he made national headlines, he made national TV, 3 appearances, and it worked to the extent of believers thought he was a psychic, but this is hardly a surprise. That's how he was billed. He came over as a psychic. That's what believers would naturally accept. So when, at long last, it was revealed on national TV that Bob Steiner, posing under the name of Steve Turbo, Steve Turbo, the psychic from...
Turbo, T-U-R-B-O?
T-O-R-B-O-T. Turbo.
Oh,
Turbo.
gotcha.
I think it was an anagram.
I like Steve Turbo even more.
Steve Turbo.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, in 1984 in Australia, somebody coming from San Francisco was pretty exotic anyway. And it was revealed. So, here's... people can see that in the front. I apologize, it's not up on the back. It's a newspaper clipping from the time. It says, anger over hoax. And I've got a whole page here, as reported in our journal at the time, of angry, disappointed and sad reaction from mostly believers, of course. A few skeptics wrote in saying, haha, that was really clever, you fooled them again, great skeptics, you know, pat on the back, right? Aren't we clever? But the long-term, their aim originally was to fool believers. Well, that's hardly a surprising thing to do. It's not very clever, it's not very hard to do. But if their aim was to try and change people's minds so they won't be fooled again, or the media, then they failed miserably. They succeeded in getting a little bit of publicity for the Australian skeptics. Just 4 years later, we had the famous Carlos hoax. Now, that's a much more widely known hoax. It was in the movie An Honest Liar. People are vaguely familiar with the Carlos hoax? James Rand, I don't know if he's here this morning, his partner Davey posed as the amazing Carlos. Now, in the late 80s, that's when channeling was very popular. That's channeling, for those of you who don't know, somebody sitting in the chair, they flutter their eyes. I am the amazing Carlos from 2,000 years ago, put on a funny voice and say New Age things. Shirley MacLaine was very much into it. So the idea was Richard Carlton, who was a reporter on our 60 Minutes and a really good skeptic, came to the United States, had a long meeting with James Randi, decided to bring this Davy out, posing as Carlos, who would go around Australia doing this channeling act. And he'd be sitting there in a media conference, rocking back and forth with a funny voice, and Randy was backstage feeding him lines through an earpiece, just gibberish, you know, like the gibberish in this article we're talking about. Why do people fall down? Because the earth is there and the gravity works back. You know, just nonsense things, absolutely nonsense things. There will be a great change of shift of consciousness soon. Everybody will feel it. Finally, one of the big things they did, they had a Carlos event at the Sydney Opera House and almost packed out the auditorium in the Opera House. It was incredible. People did actually fall for it. And it made national headlines. This is only 1988. Now, if you think about it, only 4 years earlier, the Australian media were hoaxed and fooled by someone pretending to be psychic. 4 years later, it happened again. So if the aim for the original hoax was to teach the media anything, it didn't. But then again, the media are going to have a hot story anyway. They don't care. It's a hot story. Finally, it was revealed on 60 Minutes that Carlos was indeed Davy, and Randy brought him out to hoax everybody. And it was aimed specifically at the media, to show the Australians that their television media in particular was not reliable, could be conned and hoaxed and fooled. Well, if you think the media said, oh, well, thank goodness somebody showed us we're all fools. If you think that they took that in good spirit, absolutely not. They were as pissed as hell. So as far as the media is concerned, it really backfired. They hated the skeptics after that for making them look foolish to their viewing public. It didn't go down well. Every cloud has a silver lining. There are lessons we can learn from that hoax. But if we look at the aims of both those hoaxes, they weren't met. But other things have come about. So why we're sitting here at this panel today is because we're talking about another hoax that I think we can all broadly agree fell flat in its original aims, but at least we're here to talk about the issue.
Well, I think the question of targeting is an interesting one. So
Yeah.
for both the ones you mentioned, these are aimed at a fairly large group of people, right, who were taken in by these hoaxes. Now, if you ask the question, who is taken in by this paper, I mean, maybe it's 2 referees, right? There may be
That's a
2
good point.
people,
Yeah, that's
right?
a good point. And do you think anybody reading it would be taken in? I mean, the broader audience?
The article was immediate. I think within a day or 2 after the hoax was revealed, it was taken down from the website. You can still, if you read the Skeptic, if you want to read the article, and it is an entertaining read if you read it, like, I encourage you to check it out. You can go to the Skeptic magazine article to see an archived copy of it. But in this case, I'd say there were 2, of course, anonymous referees who were maybe taken in by it. Or I think if it's a pay-to-publish journal, probably they're just encouraged to publish everything. So it's not even, taken in there isn't even necessarily the right word. These guys probably just did some token things, which the authors admit. They say, you know, adjust a few references, add a few references, change some phrasing. But was anyone really deceived by this? It doesn't seem to be.
So I wanted to add also another thing that if you look at the expose, the critique, several other points were brought up by Boghossian and Lindsay, and one of the things is, oh look, we made up references that don't exist, or we thought it's the random stuff, and the referees didn't pick on it. It's like they have never actually refereed the paper. Right. I mean, it doesn't work that way. There is very good evidence that typically referees of even high-level journals do not check the references. Because the idea is that if I'm a referee, first of all, I don't have the time. Remember, I'm not paid to do that kind of work, right? It's all pro bono. I don't have the time. A typical article may cite something like 50, 60, 70 references. Do you really seriously expect the referee to actually go there and check every one of those references before accepting the paper? It's just not going to happen. It never happened. It never will happen. And we know this. You know how? Because There are now a number of studies that track references and citations, and they show that a lot of authors themselves don't check the references, and they just repeat somebody else's references. You know how we know that? Because there are typos in the references. And these typos can be seen and tracked from one paper to another. Like, for generations of papers, people don't check. This is just the way it works. And the reason it works this way, it's not good. I mean, I'm not defending the practice. But the reason it works this way is because we have to look at the reality of things. There are thousands and thousands of papers, scientific papers, or papers in the humanities and science, in philosophy and so on, published every week. Thousands and thousands of papers, okay? So we got to the point where you simply cannot expect the referees to do their job. The referees basically start with the assumption that this is not a hoax. They start with the assumption it's not a fraud either, right? One of the reasons it's so easy, relatively speaking, to actually get even science journals, even fairly high-level science journals, to publish fabricated data is because there's no way for me as a referee to check whether the data was fabricated or not. The assumption is that this is a legitimate academic who is doing legitimate research. This is just an assumption. If it fails, then it takes a lot of work to actually figure out later, and that's why there is, there are blogs like Retraction Watch, for instance, that actually track the number of articles that in peer-reviewed journals that get retracted, and the list is huge. And it's mostly science papers, not philosophy papers.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to my own experience as a theoretical physicist. If I get a 120-page article, which are published pretty regularly in my field, and there are 300 equations in it, and am I going to check every single one of those to make sure that they're right? No, absolutely not. I'll check the major points, see if they make sense, do some basic calculations, and, read through the thing thoroughly. But if it looks like, it's a generally good idea, that stuff gets through.
I think there were a few red flags in there, though. Like in their bio, they said, we looked at Twitter hashtag trends and as part of our research and things like that. But I think this, the paper does highlight that what I think is important is continually challenging institutions. And okay, if the authors make mistakes sometimes, but maybe somebody should be at least checking some of those references. I mean, if they were all, I'm assuming they were all fraudulent, right? The references
I don't think
were all made up.
All
No, they're
there's like a Judith Butler
Okay.
reference and other legitimate things.
Well, somebody should be doing some checks. I mean, it's possible that they checked and they happened to choose one that was right, and so they made assumptions from that. But these are some of the loopholes that you say, with thousands of papers being published, in a publish or perish kind of academic environment, there's a lot of pressure on not only journal editors to get papers out, authors to publish, and also reviewers, getting through. So, there's so much pressure on reviewers to edit these things. So, but it is, I think that's suggestive of the model of journal publishing in general.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was saying, it is a systemic problem, but this is a problem that has been existing now for years and it's gotten only worse. The only way I can see out at this point, if we're talking about seriously taking a look at sort of the problem of academic publishing and all that sort of stuff, the system is actually already getting out of the problem by itself in this way. Peer review, when we talk about peer review, we understand, technically that's just the pre-publication review of papers. But in fact, peer review in academic fields is never ending. Once you publish the paper, then the paper is out there and people read it and they look at it and say, what the hell was this guy saying? And then they're going to write a critique or they're going to write something else in response and so on. That is actually a never-ending peer review. So what actually happens is that all of this stuff gets selected out. There's a lot of garbage out there. I would wager, I'm just making up numbers now on the spot, but I would wager that 95% of the stuff that gets published in academic journals these days is either garbage or irrelevant.
I would say that's low. I think it's high.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. And we also have data about this. So there is, because people do sort of bibliometric studies about tracking how papers are published and then cited and so on and so forth. And a few years ago there was a study that concerned major biology journals. So that's my field. I know which journals are the major journals. And I know where I go when I want to find something. Okay, the study showed that two-thirds of every paper published in all of the top 20 journals in biology are never cited once, except by their own authors. This is the top journals. This is not, we're not talking unranked all the way down to number 255. We're talking top journals. 2/3 of that stuff is never cited by anybody, which means that people think that it's irrelevant, that it's not interesting, that it's not going anywhere. So it could be wrong, it could be full of mistakes, it could be wrong, probably is full of bad references. Nobody gives a crap, because the people only tend to concentrate on the few papers, and they're very few, that actually are likely to make an impact in the field. The rest is just ignored.
Yeah. In theoretical physics, at least theoretical high-energy physics, the peer review, formal peer review process de facto does not exist for us, right? There's an open access archive where preprints are published, and short of a few things, like you can't, it'll reject, if your paper has the word fuck in it, probably that paper is going to get rejected. So there's some like bots that reject some big red flags, but otherwise everything gets through. And I personally would argue that the community and physics research is stronger for it, because you have this informal peer review process that then, as you say, drags on for a long time. People cite the articles they want to cite, they carefully check them, there's a discourse, and then the rest of it just kind of falls by the wayside. So
it's partly a question of the sheer volume.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look on the high energy physics theory HEP-TH or archive, on the archive sometimes there's between 5 and sometimes 20 papers published per day.
Whoa.
Right, weekdays. So,
Yeah.
but still, it's just a staggering amount of pages.
Well, it's getting back to the point that there's certain assumptions made when you're reviewing something that you don't have the time to check every possible reference. But it sort of reminds me of a criticism I get sometimes being a skeptic. People try to score points saying, oh, you're a skeptic. Are you skeptical about sitting on the chair in case it'll break, or are you skeptical the door will fall open when you open it? You can't be skeptical about everything all the time. You can't double check everything throughout your life. It sounds to me like that with the review system. You have to assume to an extent that they're not trying to pull a hoax on you for a start.
But I would like to go back, however, to what is the meaning of this thing for the skeptic community, right? Because, and I think the news there is not good, as I think I mentioned pretty clearly at the beginning. What bothers me about this episode is not just that Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay have done that. Yeah, whatever. They had fun. They went after what they thought was an easy target, and they got some publicity out of it. Great. That's not the problem. The problem for me is that very long list of leading skeptics who immediately jumped on it and endorsed this as if this were, obviously true, obviously great, obviously, et cetera, et cetera. That is a failure of leadership in the skeptic community. Almost everybody who is anybody in the skeptic community commented positively, with the exception, by the way, of our own Steve Novella. He was Steve, right?
And
he was one of the few that said, I don't know about this thing.
pretty much all those positive voices were white male voices as well, right?
There were white male voices, but that is yes, that bothers me in and of itself. But that, I think, is mostly a reflection of the fact that still the skeptic movement doesn't have a lot of female leaders, and so it's like, okay, fine.
Oh, he's just walked in. He's
There
just
it is.
back
Steve, I just
Steve
paid you a
Novella.
compliment.
Steve!
He's not looking at us, guys. There he is.
Speak of the devil, right. So that is the thing that bothers me, right? Because it actually betrays a very serious and very problematic ideological slant within the skeptic community. First of all, it's a failure of critical thinking. Okay, these people just jumped on this thing without even knowing any of the details, I guarantee you, none of these people knows anything at all about gender studies. None. And you can tell, I know for sure about Peter because I asked him directly. Okay, I know for sure about Jerry Coyne because I asked him directly. And the rest, I don't really think they spend their time seriously analyzing gender studies or even any philosophy papers, period. So this is a failure of leadership. And now when I pointed that out on, on my blog post about this thing, somebody immediately said, oh, but this is the skeptic movement. We don't have leaderships. Bullshit. Of course we do. Right? Leaders are not somebody you elect as the president of the Skeptic Society, although we do have that kind of stuff as well, actually. This is the prominent voice, right?
Oh, me? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
right? I mean, come on. We do have leaders in that formal sense.
Elected twice, yes.
But more, how many votes?
How many votes? I don't,
Wow. Things
was
just got real.
Right? So that to me is problematic. Yeah, that to me is a problem, right? Because we do, of course, we have leaders. We have people who tend to lead the movement in the sense that their voices are taken to be authoritative. They tend to be, these are the role models in the skeptic movement. Right? These are the people that write most of the books, most of the articles, publish the magazines, etc., etc. So to tell me that, oh, we don't have leaders because we're skeptic, is just a massive amount of self-delusion it takes to do that sort of stuff. So that is the part that really bugs me.
One question I'm curious about for you guys, Massimo and Skye, is, at least to me, the article kind of smacked of weird academic infighting. So in the sense that I'm curious what the relationship is between philosophers and gender studies departments. So I mean, I'm somewhat sensitive to this myself as a string theorist, because string theorists are, there was some weird academic infighting about the legitimacy of string theory. That
String theory is a pseudoscience, right? Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's say goodbye. No, I would be happy to talk about that. Well, we did that last year, I guess, actually. But yeah, I don't want to say string theory is the gender studies of physics, but that'd be a fun quote if I could say that.
That's a quotable one, yeah.
Yeah, right. Anyway, but I'm curious so a part of this, and I really do hate to use the phrase punching down, because I think it's overused and it feels almost just like a shibboleth, but was any of this philosophers taking aim at what they consider a lesser academic enterprise?
Scott.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, academia tends to be a little bit siloed, well, a lot siloed. Yeah, and I feel like it was it was mean-spirited, and taking aim at a relatively new field compared to, say, philosophy or mathematics. But one thing, what Massimo was saying, it reminded me, I know it's controversial to bring up Nietzsche in this field, but he said, a man of wisdom has to know how to be friends to his enemies and enemies to his friends. And I think with the leadership, especially within the skeptic community, they need to be skeptical and challenge other people in the field. And I think there was a failure to do that. The day that this article came out, there was overwhelming knee-jerk reaction, like to be supportive. And I think Steven Pinker later kind of moderated on that, but and once people started actually reading what this was all about, there was a lot more skepticism around.
Yeah, I agree with Skye on this. There is a little bit of academic infighting going on here, and I actually would broaden the issue. So a lot of gender studies scholars are actually philosophers. And even though they don't usually are inside the philosophy departments, although some of them have joint appointments. But what I think actually makes the distinction there is that Peter Boghossian is clearly in the area of analytic philosophy. He's a philosopher of science of the sort of classical sort of take. And most, if not all, gender studies scholars, if they're philosophers, they fall into the continental side of the divide. So this is a major split that has been around in philosophy for at least a century. And some people are trying to deny that there is any split, but I think they're fooling themselves as well. Basically what it is analytic philosophy comes out of a very logicistic approach. So it's about the use of logic, it's about the logical analysis of language, to think people about, like Bertrand Russell, for instance, is the classic early analytic philosopher. Continental philosophy tends to be more interested. It's much less into sort of precise language. In fact, a lot of continental philosophers write essays more than sort of the equivalent of a technical paper. But they tend to be also much more socially concerned. So analytic philosophers rarely write about social issues. Continental philosophers almost always write about social issues. One of the best continental philosophers probably in modern times is Michel Foucault. So these people, these two approaches to philosophy have in fact been at loggerheads for a long time, although the situation is getting a little better now. Now increasing number of departments that actually have both sides. But yeah, this is one example, certainly, of an analytic philosopher trying to punch down.
Well, I'm curious also, at least in science, right, there's the sense that if you publish a fraudulent paper like Wakefield's or even a simply wrong paper and someone builds results on top of that, right, once the foundation is proven to be shaky, then a lot of the things on top of it come toppling down. And so when you hear, oh, there's a fake paper out there, there's a hoax paper, whatever, there's this idea that, okay, anything, this is bad for the field. But I'm curious, in something like continental philosophy, or even, I don't know much about how research in the humanities works at all, is there this same sense of building on previous results that once you take out the foundation, the whole structure comes tumbling down? Or is it more, we're kind of all putting bricks in the wall together and we take one thing out and the whole structure is somewhat stable?
I think the latter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in any realm of academic study, that's what happens. And like we said, this is just one case, and it's not going to, I think, bring down the field of gender studies, just as some of these other hoax papers in science don't bring down this field of science.
And certainly it's not like this paper was let to build and stew for 10 years where people were using it foundationally. No one, people looked at this and then it was retracted. No one used it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, their aim wasn't surely to bring down the field. It was just to show that how it could be hoaxed.
Right.
And if their aim was to bring down the field, that would be ridiculous to begin with.
No, of course.
Well, I think actually that was the aim indirectly, and that is why it was ridiculous to begin with. Yeah, I really do think. If you read the commentary that Boghossian and Lindsay themselves published, that was pretty much one of their aims. They claimed that the second aim was, to expose the paper to publish.
That's an ambitious aim.
It certainly is, especially on a sample size of n equal 1.
Yes.
And I think that the entire field cannot, fields like that cannot be brought down. We have example because what does that even mean, for one thing, right?
Yeah.
I can bring down the entire field of astrology by criticizing the foundations, both theoretical and empirical of astrology, but this is not something that can be possibly done with a field in the humanities. It just doesn't, it's not that kind of thing. And again, let's look at the sciences. Psychology, which is a science, it's not a pseudoscience, regardless of what some people think. Right now, for the last few years, is going through a major crisis of replication. Anywhere between a third and half of major findings that are actually in psychology textbooks. So this is not something, this guy found that yesterday. No, in psychology textbooks, so stuff that is well established, it turns out it's not replicable, or if it's replicable, the effects are not as large as they were originally, and so on and so forth. Now, what is it that we're doing now? Are we actually declaring psychology a failed field? No. We are, the psychologists themselves are the first ones to jump in there and say, okay, let's clean up here. There's some serious problems. That doesn't invalidate the entire field. It doesn't invalidate every single paper in the field. It just means that there is an issue. And there are reasons why there is issues. Because psychology experiments are actually difficult to do. Okay, most of the times they're done using psychology undergraduate students because they're cheap. But the problem with psychology undergraduate students is they have a volition of their own, so they respond in whatever, and the sample sizes tend to be small. There are actual serious issues. So if you have serious issues with gender studies or any other or any branch of philosophy or the humanities, then what you ought to do is the real work. Go read the literature. Engage in criticism from both within the field and, if you want, outside of the field. But that takes years. That takes scholarship. That takes getting into the details of what these people are saying and showing why you think that they're wrong. That's nothing like that has happened in this case.
Yeah, I'm reminded of,
Thank you.
I'm reminded, because this is what I do, of the divide between, say, string theory and loop quantum gravity, where there's a perennial debate between the two. And I can think of one or two cases of string theorists who actually went to loop quantum gravity, studied it for many years. Yeah, they got sick of pseudoscience, and then really tried to come up with a detailed critique of it. There's this. Most people are willing to say, yeah, that's not right, without doing a lot of the intellectually rigorous stuff that you need to do. A few people go over and do it, but not many.
One of the main things that they wanted to do was employ ridiculous language and academic jargon and throw it all together and say, look, this is what gender studies is. And I would suggest that it's not just gender studies, it's like most of academia. Pick up any journal, it's like a whole lot of bad writing in 99% of journals, if not more. So I think that was actually a really good point to critique the bad language in journals, but not exclusively for gender studies.
And also, I mean, I think you might have pointed this out in your article, Massimo, this kind of fraudulent bullshit article happens all the time in sciences. Like people, there's the get me off your fucking mailing list paper, right, that the guy published. It was a computer science, something like that. There are, auto-generated papers that consist of the same sentence over and over, and these get published like constantly in scientific journals, and you never hear people cheering about the death of computer science.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Not only that, but so again, I see this in terms of bringing it back to the skeptic community as reflective of a general attitude that has developed in some quarters of the skeptic community, especially in the leadership of skeptic community, over the last, let's say, decade or so, which is a type of scientism, a type of disdain for anything that is not science. I mean, you can see this easily, not only in this Hoax, but my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, who complains about two things about philosophy. Philosophers use technical language, jargon, and only philosophers of science read papers in philosophy of science. Great. As opposed to what? Quantum mechanics physics, where there is no jargon and everybody reads quantum mechanics? I mean, what the hell? What is this about, right? It's like...
It's called academics, right?
Yeah, exactly. Every academic field has jargon, and in any academic field, I guarantee you, most of the people that read those papers are other academics in that field. That's it.
Yeah.
So
with that, we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to, should we take some questions from the audience? Because I suspect that people have a bunch of questions or comments.
So it sounds like there are three parts to this topic. There's the discussion about the validity of this hoax for gender studies, the validity of hoaxes, and then the validity of gender studies. And we covered those two first parts pretty well, but I'm curious about that last part. What do you all think about the validity of gender studies, what the flaws of it are today, or if we don't know enough about that, what we would need to do to be able to answer that question?
In short, and please someone disagree with this, I don't think we have any gender studies experts up here. So speaking for myself, look, I'm certainly not qualified to talk about that, but I don't know.
Just briefly, yes. Yeah, the old expression is if you don't really know what you're talking about, don't talk about it. So broadly speaking, I don't know enough about gender studies to give you an honest answer in that respect.
Well, so I've read papers in gender studies. I have colleagues who are in gender studies, but I'm not an expert on gender studies. And what I can see is that this is a legitimate academic field in the sense that it represents a particular approach to a particular kind of social issues. That's what it is, right? Now, of course, within that field, there are people who present certain points of view. There is a dominance of a particular point of view over others at times, depending. But that is true for pretty much any field,
for sure.
right? Especially any field that has social relevance, right? Including science fields, by the way. The history of biology, and there is certain areas of biology, and certainly the history of psychology, sociology, economics. We want to talk about the ideological biases of economics for a change. So if the question is, are there sort of ideological biases, and are there sort of prevalent point of view? And they are, just like in lots of other places. But again, if you want to criticize them, you better engage them directly. You can't do that through a hoax.
Yeah, I think you condemn an entire field of academic studies with many people doing it at your own peril in general. All right, next question.
Thank you.
Hi, so thank you for having this.
Oh, sorry. Let's go back there first. Yeah.
Okay.
No, wait. She's giving you permission. Go for it.
Okay. Sorry. When I was in academia, in my field at least, it was very common for journals to, when they needed a peer reviewer, they wanted to send it to somebody who knew the field. So it was very common for them to send journals to peer reviewers who were referenced in the paper being reviewed, which created a conundrum for the peer reviewers, because if the paper supported their research, they would had an incentive to support the paper. But if the paper went against their research, they had an incentive to torpedo it, or even worse, just put it in a drawer somewhere for weeks at a time, slowing down the paper's resolution. How do you address that kind of conflict of interest?
I mean, I think that it's just something, well, it's not good, but I think it's not, first of all, it's not quite what we're talking about here right now. Certainly I acknowledge that exists, but, you know, some people are going to be assholes, is what it comes down to, and you can do anything you want, but you kind of can't prevent people from being jerks if they're going to be jerks. Now, in that case, if they put it in a drawer and don't look at it, you can say, I mean, this has happened to me in things I've submitted to journals, look, guys, I'm not getting a response, move this to a different referee, this person's not doing anything about it. And often, you can appeal referee reports, too. So if you don't like that referee says nonsense or petty kind of criticisms, you can move it over to a different referee. And yes, that takes time, and yes, it's bad, but, you know, can you prevent people from being jerks? Ultimately, no.
There might also be an incentive for people to push through papers that do critique their own work as well, because it's, as Massimo said, you know, there's so few references to other academic journals, like to other academic papers, that I would say that, okay, not necessarily any publicity, bad publicity is good publicity, but it is, you know, I would be happy for someone to reference my paper even if they critiqued it, because they're referencing me.
Also, I mean, most academics, I do think this is the case, are intellectually honest. Right, and I certainly know plenty of physicists who will gladly, you know, seek out work that disagrees with them, and if it, you know, cites them, that's fine. I think, in my personal experience, anecdotally, most people are going to be intellectually honest about that sort of thing. All right, question back there, yeah.
Sorry, thank you for having this discussion. I do wonder why some of you are so certain that the aim of the hoax was to discredit gender studies as a whole. James Lindsay on Twitter has said, I mean, I asked him about this. He said, we aimed at opening a discussion that exposes every bit of it that's infected by postmodernism to help facilitate a real study of gender. And I just see that I'm just wondering why it's so certain and why it's going around so far that that they were completely aiming to discredit the entire field. I think that's just a bit of a stretch to say that.
Well, postmodernism is broader than gender studies. So if they were after postmodernism, that is even worse. It doesn't help them.
Yeah. If I can quote from the paper, as I did in the beginning, they say the following, quote, part of the fault may fall on the open access pay-to-publish model, but the rest falls on the entire academic enterprise collectively referred to as gender studies. So I don't think we're putting words in their mouths when we say they're attempting to discredit, quote, the entire academic enterprise collectively referred to as gender studies. They say that nakedly, no pun intended. That's four in the paper.
On top of which, not all gender studies papers or authors will recognize themselves as postmodernist. In fact, most of them probably wouldn't. So it's a weird thing to say. Now, the reference to postmodernism may have come about because Sokol's Hoax, of course, was about postmodernism. So that was actually a very different target. And I mentioned earlier on what Sokol himself says about it. So,
yeah. All right. Next question. Back. Let's see. Oh wait, no, we got one right here first.
Once they publish a hoax, what's the chance of them never being credited with any future articles that they try to present?
I mean, that's a question for my colleagues in philosophy over here.
You mean what is the chance that Boghossian is not going to be able to publish anything?
Once they present the hoax and get it published,
right,
their credibility is shot in the future.
Well, yeah, it's
Skye, you look like you're about to.
Possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think they didn't think that. I think they thought it would make them more credible.
Hopefully you'll get a chance to.
So, I don't know. I think people would be looking twice at their work, but in journals, it's usually blind peer reviewed, so you don't actually know who the people are anyway. But if I was an editor of a journal, I'd certainly be looking twice at whether that was a real paper that they were publishing.
In philosophy, you don't know who the authors are when you review?
Usually it's blind peer reviewed.
Right,
so when it goes out to the reviewers, the names aren't attached.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
In fact, yeah, that's right. And that's something that has been done increasingly also in a number of science papers. I mean, several journals in biology now. Because it used to be that the authors were known but the reviewers are anonymous, which clearly creates an imbalance, right? Because the reviewer can get away with really nasty stuff. You don't know who it is. And the author, on the other hand, is known to reviewer. Now, a lot of papers, increasing number of journals, certainly in philosophy, this has been the case for a long time. They actually take out the name, and they actually even ask the authors to submit a separate version of the paper with no self-citations or with any references to personal stuff taken out.
That's interesting. In physics, that's not the case, and at least in theoretical physics, it's not the case because everything appears on the preprint server first. So if you didn't know what it was, you saw that abstract last week, All right, question back there.
Yes, a little disclaimer. I worked for the company that declined publishing for 19 years, but in the STM field books. And one comment was, I hear all this about publishers, the for-profit publishers being so greedy for profit, and you don't understand what goes on behind the scenes in rooting out this kind of thing. And we do check references. I personally did. I had systems in place. We put a lot of money into furthering the science, things like Crossref and ORCID, which authors hate registering for. Yet this kind of hoax creates that conundrum where we have to check. Second, I do want to ask if you are calling out the skeptic community of being guilty of the same thing Andrew Wakefield is in doing sloppy science by reporting this as a hoax.
Okay, I'm going to make a comment on the first point, but I don't understand exactly what the second question is. Can you rephrase it?
The fact is, they lost their objectivity.
Oh, yeah.
And they were not doing what a scientist should do and doing their homework to research what went on.
Yeah, I would say that they were not doing what a skeptic should be doing. Neither one of the authors is a scientist to begin with. And this was definitely not a science paper. It was aimed at being published in a philosophy journal or in a gender studies journal. So no, I don't think that it's fair to call out these people as bad scientists. And it's certainly different from the case of Wakefield, as for the reasons you pointed out a few minutes ago. First of all, Wakefield was actually not perpetrating a hoax. He was fraudulent, but that's a different issue. So no, I wouldn't call them out for that. I would call them out as, a failure within the skeptic movement. If we're supposed to be doing, exercising critical thinking, as I said, Peter actually teaches critical thinking, then we should have known better. Not only them, the two of them as authors of the Hoax, but also all of those people that I mentioned earlier, with the exception of Steve, that actually immediately joined the chorus. To go back to your issue with publishing, yeah, things are getting better, partly because it's technologically feasible now to do these kind of things, right? So you can actually register papers and cross-reference them automatically. But again, individual reviewers are simply not going to do that. If you do it as a publisher, kudos to you. But my experience has been for many, many years that lots of things slip through because people just don't have the time. There's just no incentive. People are not paid for doing these kind of things. It takes a lot of time to even read the paper carefully several times. When I've reviewed the paper, I have to read the paper several times carefully, make plenty of comments, detailed comments, and so on and so forth, in order to try to be useful to the community and to the journal. So things may be getting better in part because of these issues, because somebody does publish a fraudulent paper or a hoax kind of paper, and therefore the publishers and the academic community say, oh, wait, how did that happen? What can we do to fix it? And partly because the technology is getting better. So the more people read, this is actually very similar to the stuff that is going on in psychology that I mentioned earlier, right? So one of the positive reactions to the failure of replication in the psychology community and in the medical science community, medical research community, is now the rise of pre-registering sites where people go there and say, okay, before I do the research, this is my hypothesis, this is how I'm going to test them. Now the web makes it possible for journals to archive the full data set. so that if a reviewer actually is not convinced that there is something right in the results section of a paper, they can go back now and actually redo the analysis. I'm not sure how many people bother doing that because that's a lot of work, but it's possible, right? So technology is making things better.
Well, with that, we are out of time for this panel. So I want to, first of all, thank our panelists, Richard Saunders, Massimo Pigliucci, and Skye Cleary for being with us today. Can we have a round of applause for them? I want to thank all of you guys for coming out first thing on a Sunday morning and for your questions. We'll be around for a little bit, and have a great rest of NECSS 2017. Thanks so much.